Okay, so we want to welcome to the stage our next couple of presenters, Emerson Nafziger and Kaiyu. Emerson, huge fan of Emerson over the years. Really, my favorite Emerson interview was the one that DeLoss did a couple of years ago, maybe. It's been a few. But anyway, he got Emerson to laugh, and I thought that was pretty awesome. So Emerson earned degrees in agronomy from Ohio State, Purdue, and the U of I. He joined the University of Illinois faculty as an extension agronomist back in '82 and spent his career working on crop management and in more recent years on soil fertility, especially nitrogen management for corn, officially retiring in 2017 but remains active in research and extension with emphasis on nitrogen management. Emerson?
Thank you. We're going to talk about the MRTN, and some of you heard me talk about this a lot. So I'm just going to introduce the topic, and then Kaiyu will talk about what we might be doing going forward. The maximum return to nitrogen is developed in the 2000s, and it replaced a yield goal in 2007, 2008. It adjusts for N and corn prices, and the MRTN is the approach, but we can use it to refer to the N rate. So when you say the MRTN rate, just understand what that is. It is a prediction based on previous data. So how do we go about this? You can see here on the left, there's a nitrogen response curve, and below that, this nitrogen response curve was turned into a nitrogen economic response. So this is what we do with each set of data that we get. It's converted to an economic response. So we're going to go through this pretty quickly. I've been talking about it now the last month, and this is 200 N response trials in central Illinois, corn following soybean. And you can see they're kind of all over the place. We turn that into an economic response, just subtracting the nitrogen rate. We subtract the yield with no nitrogen and just turn it into a nitrogen response. So these are the return to N responses, and we can do this. We can change the ratio of corn price to N price, and that's what we do. These show a wide range of shapes, as I said, and from very low or even negative return to N to very high return to N. So we just take those, then crunch them together, and so we average those 200 trials in this case, and we get one master curve. And you can see here that this shows 172 as the optimum N rate for these curves, and it also has a range around that optimum. So we noticed that it was fairly, that the response was fairly flat on top. So we said, well, we can't really justify, saying that this has a big response in that range. And so that's what we did. This is one that, everybody's been waiting to see this for a while. This is the actual N yield responses for the corn N rate trials in northern, central, and southern Illinois. And these are pretty, this is an informative thing because you can see that northern Illinois and southern Illinois are kind of parallel. Central Illinois is not quite parallel, but that's the number of trials there. So we have 61 trials in northern Illinois, 284 in central Illinois, and 128 in southern Illinois. And we also have a set of corn following corn trials, and I just put those in there. So you can choose in the calculator to look at corn following corn and or corn following soybean. So we have an option in the NREC calculator to compare multiple prices. And that's what I'm showing you here. So it says multiple prices, and we used here corn at $5 and end prices ranging from 50 cents to 75 cents to $1 to $1.25. When you do that, it's no surprise that the optimum nitrogen rate actually goes down. It simply takes, it simply doesn't, takes less nitrogen to maximize return. And so that's what we find. Does it really work? And this is probably the biggest knock. People look at this and say, well, does that really work? It's no two NREC trials are exactly alike. So basing the MRTN on data from previous trials means that it predicts for a given field in a given year, and that prediction is almost never perfect. It's an average over all those trials. It is, though, the best guess we have. And with end responses unpredictable, we either use results like this over a lot of trials or we make it up. And so we don't want to make it up. And making it up is things like just use plenty of nitrogen. So efforts to model nitrogen needs, supply, and loss to determine how much N to apply, these have not worked very well. And I guess I thought at one time they would work better than they do, but they just don't. So if the goal is to produce maximum yield, not maximum profit, then this approach doesn't work. It is designed to maximize profit, net income, not yield. This is what we have over the last 8 or 9 years. And as we've added new data and canceled out or removed some of the older data, we've seen these go up. And, that's Southern Illinois now has the highest N rate, recommended N rate of any of the central or northern Illinois. And that makes sense because it doesn't, the nitrogen supply from the soil is the main thing. And so that's where we'll leave this. This just puts numbers to those that I just showed you. So it's a bad deal when we get higher end prices. Our return to nitrogen goes down rather quickly, as you can expect. You can see here it goes from 181 at 50% nitrogen and $5 corn to 165 at 75% nitrogen to 152 at $1 nitrogen to 125 when nitrogen's $1.20. Sorry, 141 when nitrogen's $1.25. Now we can do playing with these numbers and see, well, what happens if you say I'm not going to reduce my nitrogen rate. In fact, I'm going to produce I'm going to add the maximum that it takes to maximize yield. And you see there at the bottom what happens when you do that. We just lose money. So that's the warning. We can say, well, maybe these don't predict very well, but we don't have any good reason to say that. So I suggested a small trial and, to do 2 rates. And we met this morning, and I think we'd like to also leave an option to leave those rates going as strips all the way through the field. Higher rates and lower rates, basically. And sort of like this. So what we're trying to do is build confidence that when you lower the rate, you're not losing a lot of yield. And I think that's what we will see. I'm going to turn this over to Kaiyu now, and he's going to talk about some of the other wonders that are coming when we look at this MRTN approach.
Yeah, first, thanks, Emerson already made a very thorough introduction of MRTN, and I think before I talk about the sort of the future work, I think I can reflect a little bit of me working with Emerson. So I joined the University of Illinois for 6 years, and initially when I started the program, I lent some effort in the university, also in some effort from the industry, and I sort of have a big curiosity about nitrogen applications. And then so I start to talk to Emerson, and I think he's always very patient in guiding me through things. And then later on, I realized how, big effort that he has been working on over the so many years of developing this type of the MRTN data behind all these trial data across the state. I was really amazed about that. And then later on, Emerson gave me more opportunity to show his data and say, Kaiyu, could you model that? What have you learned about that? And there's a lot of challenges. I don't want to go to details, but I think there's a lot of also fun part and understand the simplicity as well as the elegance behind MRTN. Because if we are building a tool for farmers, if you make it very complicated, you have to ingest all these numbers, it will not work. This is to start with. So the MRTN give you the response, give you the answer that actually have a very big elegance behind this and start to really gain the appreciation. This probably explains why the tools has been such widely used. The second point that I start to realize more about is when you are doing this, sort of academic research in the modeling side, if you are not talking to if you are not using the real data, if you are not talking to the people who have really experienced doing this field work, especially people like, Dan Schiffer, John Pike, all these people really helped maintain these sites and doing all this fantastic work over the time. And I feel that we learned a lot from the people who are really working on the ground. And so I would say that I'm very grateful that I can be here and talk about something that, call that as a future of MRTN, but it's really an exaggeration. It's something that we've been thinking about, is if we can sort of thinking about all the data that we collected, all the stuff, all the continued effort that NREC will invest on nitrogen trials, including university and the industry will continue working on this topic. What can we do something that is meaningful? And then I gotta be very careful of going to the tool side because it's very hard to build a tool, compete with MRTN. So that's not a possibility, I feel, but it's possible that if we take MRTN's concept and philosophy, and then sort of slightly adding some, factors that we can possibly, address, but also with a good confidence. So it's a step-by-step effort that, I believe if ultimately we want the farmers to use these tools, we need to make the tool really accurate and robust, and at the same time, still elegant to use, easy to use. So I think with that, I think gonna talk a few things that what we've been thinking about. And most of these, actually, I feel the audience already mentioned, already understand. So, some of this stuff is the research that my group has been extensively working on is really related of working with some of the real trial data that university and other researchers collected over the time, so the state. And then most of these trial data are, what Emerson and MRTN tools ultimately build to feed the data to get the curve. But then we use these data to try to see, okay, given that particular location in terms of the soil, in terms of the weather, in terms of the crop history, can we use these data to use the models to reproduce these responses? The hope is that if the model actually work, then we can actually use model to do something that do virtual trials. Let's put it this way. But there's a lot of effort going into this. But this is sort of the research work that we've been working on. We use models very rigorously corroborate. Use Emerson's data, but use models to very rigorously corroborate some of our model simulations. And then, so a few things that when you remember, Emerson shows a lot of the data, a lot of the MRTN curve, and then they pretty widely spread out. And then one thing that we been thinking a lot about is what explains that variabilities. And then so there are some 4 factors that, at least the top 3 factors that we think could be interesting to think about. One is when, every field has different soil conditions. For sure that's true. Weather information can be different for all these trials. And then even for the same trial, year to year variability can be different. And then also, I hear some of the researchers talk about side dressing. We have fall application or spring application or potentially side dressing. And then will that make a difference? And at least currently we haven't considered that complexity in the model. And then ultimately, we also start to be interested in nitrogen leaching in GHG emission. Even some of the soil carbon thing that people start to talk a lot, which is related to carbon credit. So something along these lines is is the stuff that we're really interested in exploring. And this represents some of the early thinking and effort. Still in the very early stage. I actually appreciate NREC willing to support some of these efforts. Continue let us working on this. So one aspect that we've been thinking about is the soil type. And we are using, this is at one location, but we are hypothetically switch the initial soil carbon from the soil using different numbers. And then you actually can see that in the model simulation world, you actually can see if you have different initial soil organic carbon, even you give the same weather, you are growing the same type of corn, you're actually gonna have a different response of the yield nitrogen response. And then, so this basically means that, soil type, if you have that information, ideally you should incorporate that type of information. And I believe everybody understands this general aspect. It's just how can we do that probably, in a more efficient and easy way if farmers want to have this information. Another aspect that we've been thinking about is actually inspired by Lower Gentry. And when I initially joined, the Lower told me that he always find the weather before the planting, the springtime weather, always be interesting to study. He's very curious about what's the implication because he see that play a role in his data set. And that's sort of potentially some of the inspiration come from is one of my PhD student, I asked him the same question. I said, can we do something? Can we use models to study that? And then this is a paper that coming recently out, in the journal that co-authored with Lowell, we try to understand, given the spring weather difference in terms of temperature and then rainfall, and then what would lead to a different response of the nitrogen yield curve. And then the story or the understanding behind it is not difficult to understand because if you have a very warmer spring, you potentially the soil decomposition rate may be increased, and you may have increased condition of decomposition and respiration. And then if you have more water, you may leach more inorganic nitrogen currently in the soil. And so some of this actually been tested and then show in the study that this matters. Then the point is it possible to can include some of this information into the model or into the MRTN solutions? Again, I think this is just sort of the ideal situation. We still need to find a way that easily incorporate this type of information. This is a pretty interesting one. It's still in the early stage, very early stage, but we start to thinking about so the scenario is that we want to put the same amount of nitrogen, but at 3 different times. One is put the fertilizer all in fall. After you harvest it, you put the fertilizer in. Another scenario is you put the fertilizer or the same amount of fertilizer, but in spring. And then so that's another practice that probably widely adopted nowadays. And then another possibility is that we say, okay, let's do side dressing. let's put 50% of the fixed amount in spring and 50% in some stage of the corn. And then, because it's in the model, it's validated, so we sort of go a little bit crazy. We say, okay, we can even side dressing in R2 stage, and people laugh. I get that, but that's sort of the power of a model, because we sort of can do some hypothetical scenario. So, but then in these type of the scenarios in simulations, what we have discovered is in terms of the yield response, so you will see on the right side, there is a yield response, there is also incorporating a leaching response and end-to-all response, and then you actually find that in terms of yield response, maybe the spring application and side dressing may not make a big difference, but they potentially can have implications of the leaching as well as the greenhouse gas emission. And so this is potentially the implication is not only about the previous MRTN solution, which consider yield and income, and ultimately optimized based on income. This may potentially indicate that if we start to think about somewhat some sustainability aspect, and then maybe use some way to factor that into the kind of the calculation, then maybe we may get slightly different answer. And then so to make the point further is, one aspect we've been keep thinking about yield response to nitrogen and then incorporate with the economics. But at the same time, we know that as you increase fertilizer use, if you're thinking about fertilizer use and the nitrogen loss, not used by the plants, nitrogen loss, there is actually a pretty sharp increase after a certain point that you use more nitrogen, you're gonna create pretty big loss of nitrogen that are unused. And then so how we potentially factor these factors in to our calculations. And then so this is a slide that Emerson supplied to me. He basically one possibility is that you just artificially say use actual fertilizers that haven't been used in the plants, you're actually gonna get a penalty. And then so that's a similar thing as you sort of try to take into account about nitrogen loss kind of implications. And then so I think this just sort of lay out some of our general thinking, and it's very early stage. We are not saying that all this stuff will become complicated tools of MRTN, but I think it carries some hope that we at least try to dive deeper and then thinking about the processes, thinking about the understanding of nitrogen yield response, and then potentially also improve that tools down the road. And I know it's a pretty daunting task, but I think again, all new generations of scientists inspired by the professors like Emerson that devote his whole career into this work. Just really great honor to continue working on this topic and with his guidance. And then so I think with that, if you have any question, reach out to me and Emerson. Appreciate that.